It's my great pleasure to welcome Kaushik Basu to the Ideas for India Conversation series. This is the second of these, and we kind of hope to use this platform to just have deep, engaged discussions. I mean, in a world of soundbite journalism and gotcha, big fight TV studio dynamics, there really is, I think, a missing market here for deep, engaged discussion of ideas. And I'm particularly delighted to have Professor Basu here, given his both academic and policy credentials, having been on both sides of this divide.
Let me just thank Ideas for India for doing this. And what you said in the beginning, we get a lot of economic discussion, which is little sound bites for the next morning's interest. But you miss out on some of the larger questions, which do need to be debated, and the long run benefits or even the downside can be huge of doing these things wrong. So having a forum where you allow for questions which may not quite be of interest for the next morning's headlines, but of interest to the subject is very welcome.
So Kaushik, let's just get started with, I think, a big picture question, which is the chief economist of the World Bank is probably the most prominent position from which to set a global agenda for both research and practice in growth and development. What would you characterize as your main intellectual and policy thrusts in this role since the time you've taken over in the past 15 months?
Yes, I mean, it is, I have to say, it's a forum, being chief economist of the World Bank, which I feel blessed because it does give you an opportunity for engagement with the subject, with the policy end of development economics in quite an amazing way. I mean, the reach of the global engagement is large. There are ideas, lots of important ideas to be brought to the table. First of all, I must point out that something which is a bit to do with the profession itself, the profession of economics, which to me is heartening and which makes a segue into development economics, which I'm able to steer it a little bit, give it a nudge using my position at the World Bank. You know, one important change in the economics profession is some of the extreme thinkings which were ideologically rooted without having enough grounds have become very weak. If you look at the sort of good economists, I would say the top end of it, 90–95% will be broadly sharing a lot of common ideas, which was never the case earlier. The extreme right and the extreme left fringe have somehow fallen off. And that's very important because there are two important recognitions which have come. That first of all, leaving it all to the free market, just let it run free for itself, does not work. Or even if it works, it can lead to such gross inequalities that it's going to put ordinary life in peril. The political stability is going to go. On the other hand, the belief on the other side that you can bring in the state and the state takes over and does it all has also gone out because you realize that the market, individual enterprise, creativity, these things are very powerful forces. And so this coming together of this with the edges becoming unimportant is very important for the profession itself. And I was very keen when I took up the job in the World Bank to have development economics reflect this. And this was happening on its own. I don't want to exaggerate what I've been doing, but to bring that to the table. There are a couple of other directions in which I wanted to give a push, and I think I've given a gentle push. Poverty eradication, those policies the World Bank has for long been engaged in. But to go beyond that and say that, look, it's not just poverty eradication, but there is something in terms of sharing the pie, which is important. We took it upon ourselves, and the World Bank wrote down two goals, which were actually only last year in April, formally brought in as World Bank's goals, which is that we must strive to bring down poverty in the world. Poverty, especially when you define it by $1.25 a day, which is a shockingly low poverty line. But what is even more shocking is that with that shockingly low poverty line, 1 billion people happen to be below that. So we have to fight for that. But number two, we have to fight for shared prosperity. And by that, we define that for every society, there ought to be special attention paid to the bottom 40% and how that is doing. Subsequently, the World Bank declared this last April as one of its major goals, one of its two goals, so giving it a lot of salience. This has come into play. There have been statements by the economists have written. Piketty, of course, is very prominent. IMF has gone into this topic. So this is gaining some ground. So I feel pleased because I feel this ought to be discussed in a rational way. You don't want to destroy market forces when you battle this, but at the same time, you have to nurture that. One more important move that I think I can say that I've played a role. I worked with the World Bank president early when I came in to say that economic development depends a lot on getting your fiscal policy right, monetary policy right, taxation right, but it is also rooted in human psychology, in sociology, culture and norms. In the economics profession, there is a bit of a resistance to this. It's sort of giving ground to the neighboring disciplines. But very early, we pushed for this, and now we've got a World Development Report which has just come out on the behavioral and social foundations of development, and it's doing extremely well. It's very well written, and it uses a lot of methods which you yourself are familiar with. So very powerful entry into the mainstream development economics. I was actually at an event in New York City with a very prominent policymakers over there, and it's being very well received. So it's very heartening to see that economics is a big profession. You can't sort of push and nudge and change it in a huge way, but small bits of tilting, moving is possible, and I think it's being done very nicely.
Probably the biggest pivot in the policy space in India in the past decade was kind of the pivot towards rights-based legislation of trying to secure precisely the interests of the poorest 40%, I mean that the bank is now targeting. But I think, whether you look at the NREGS or the Food Security Act or RTE, the general sense among a lot of economists is that these are extremely well-intentioned, but relatively poorly designed in terms of first principles of economics. Given that this political churn towards pivoting policy towards the poor was happening. So why have economists lost the battle conditional on wanting to do something for the poor? Why have we not had the kind of impact you would think we should be having in better design of these programs?
The economists have lost the battle, if you want to put it that way. Rather, the policymakers have lost the battle because the political economy of this was not appreciated enough. I feel economists were pretty much on the same side. Some marginal disagreements there would be about how you would do it, the need for better design, but the political economy was a problem. But let me sort of step back and point to one thing since you brought up the rights question. My own view on rights is that certain rights are extremely important and ought to be enshrined as rights. But with rights comes a responsibility and obligation that what you're enshrining as a right, you must be able to deliver on those. To write things down as rights and not deliver is to do disservice to the very concept of rights. Food, I do think, should be a right. A country is in a position, India today is in a position to guarantee everyone gets the food. The problem is, you are absolutely right, it's on the design of how you get the food to the people. But the design is the key, not the objective. Exactly. And here it is true that not enough is being done. And we have to work on this. I do feel that this is one area where, in fact, the economics profession has a lot to offer. The thing here is you have to win over the people, win over the political decision makers about the importance of the design, and not push the design aside and run on slogans. So this is a challenge that we have to take on, and I hope that economists will be able to work with politicians to be able to deliver on these better.
My own take on what's happened with economics as a profession, talking to people in other disciplines, is that I think our fundamental weakness at some level is that because the touchstone of policy evaluation is the idea of a Pareto improvement, that everybody is better off and no one is worse off, effectively economists do not question the justice of the initial positions. You kind of take the initial position as granted and say, conditional on this, how do I improve things on the margin? And given kind of the vast inequalities in the opening, opening deal of cards, so to speak, there's obviously a deep political need to kind of create the space for more pro-poor policy. But I think what happens is because economists, the professional economists have abdicated that space to kind of saying that's a philosophical political discussion and we really have nothing to say, the rights-based movement that has created the political space for the pro-poor policy has also then occupied the space of how to design it because they are the people who have created the political movement. And so I think, my own view on this this is that because economists have kind of been seen as an apologist for the status quo in many settings, that we've lost the credibility to kind of then sit down and say, listen, we are as pro-poor as you are, but conditional on these objectives, there are much, much better ways to design it.
The first line that you took, actually, I fully agree, that treating the status quo as right does abdicate something very important to others. Fortunately, on that, though, I feel in economics there is a shift now beginning to take place. And I do believe our shared prosperity talks to that. There is a range of inequality at birth. If you compute inequality at birth, and I've just done some back-of-the-envelope calculation, large part of today's inequality is inequality at birth. This, fortunately, has now come to the table. And you're probably right that this space was being given up too much to another group. But once the mainstream comes on board by saying that, no, I mean, we have to recognize that there's a great injustice, this could be corrected. Vested interests are important, but even more important are the ideas that have ossified in the head. Absolutely. So I do feel that, yes, I know that if you've got so much leakage in the food distribution system and other benefits, there are vested interests. But really the bigger restriction is, the hurdle is the block in the human mind. People who have run a particular program for the last 20 years, they may have no direct vested interest in this, but they have a vested interest in that idea. Exactly. And battling that is very difficult. And that brings me to one quick tribute to, again, a forum like this. We have to engage people in deeper discussions where that ossified ideas begin to sort of break a little bit and you begin to think afresh.
So, so coming back to some of these thrusts and things you've done in your role at the World Bank, I mean, how much of this you think has been influenced by your own research? How much of this is influenced to some extent by your experiences as the CEA? And how much has kind of modern academic research contributed to some of these priorities you're setting at the World Bank?
Well, all of those have, of course, played a role. But let me get into, yes, some concrete examples. One is the kind of research that you do. Randomized controlled trials to get to certain understandings. I feel this has played a very, very important role. And this World Bank already had quite a few people who are doing this. But we are trying to strengthen that, to do more of that. These randomized controlled trials, to me, are a method for discovering little bits of gems sitting around knowledge, sitting around unexplored. By using this technique, you can find out. Does this policy work? Does that policy not work? You do these trials, you get an insight into that. I do believe, and I have written critiques of the method in the sense that it's possible to overclaim, and it's possible to drown out other methods, which would be a pity. There's another thing where, in fact, RCTs won't work, but which happens to be very important, which was my learning during my being chief economic advisor to the Indian government. You know, all these micro-interventions tend to have macroeconomic implications. You run 1,000 programs in 1,000 villages. You then go and do trials over there, or you run the trial with the programs. You'll know what it's doing in these 1,000 villages. But running a program can have fiscal implications, monetary implications, where another village, 1,000 miles away, which has nothing to do with the village where the intervention took place, gets a fallout of this program. So you get the systemic effects, which the randomized trials would not be able to pick up, or at least not at this stage. You'd have to have much more sophisticated ones. You do need an element of macroeconomic analysis to pick this up. With macroeconomic analysis, and this was my big eye-opener sitting in the Ministry of Finance, it's a strange mixture of science and intuition, because you've got masses of data, but the controls are not perfect. It's not a randomized trial. You've got theoretical analysis trying to understand this. You've got examples from rich countries. You roughly know that if inflation takes place, you come in with this policy. If your exchange rate is depreciating, you do something else. But this is usually picked up by looking at other countries. And it's not totally clear that a rich country, the policy that it has followed, is going to work as well in a developing country. There you need intuition, you need theory, you need to do a little bit of abstract thinking, and you need judgment. And you also need little bits of experiments. You have to try odd policies at a macroeconomic level, collect the data immediately of what's happening, and then decide that, well, the American policy which worked very well in the US, will it work here? Maybe it won't. This macro-micro interaction, I am working very hard. I mean, my researchers at the World Bank are aware that I push for this. And since the World Bank is engaged in developing countries, I keep stressing that we don't want to just take lessons straight out of a rich country and take it to a poor country. We have to empower, build capacity for poor countries, emerging economies, to do their own little experiments, develop their own ideas.
The political economy leans towards more programs because this is a program that you can announce, it's a program that you can target to your preferred voter groups, it's a program that allows for patronage, but you don't nearly have the same set of incentives for investment in state implementation capacity, partly because of the perception that this payoff is beyond the electoral cycle. It feels to me that right now that is the binding constraint, that is affecting the government in sector after sector after sector. So it's not like we don't have the capacity at the top, to make good policy, but if you think about just implementation capacity, and I think of this as two pieces, one is people, the other is systems, that is something that is just really, really lacking. So the question to you is two things. One is how much is the World Bank kind of thinking not just about policy but implementation and ways in which you could systematically boost this, and which part of government could lead that?
Actually, the bank is doing a lot on this also because the current president, Jim Kim, is very keen on that last mile of the delivery. So you set up a system, but if you don't do that last mile right, you don't get the benefit to reach the people. And the examples we've been discussing all this time, a lot of examples in India itself of that happening. And we are thinking of our world development reports that have taken place, starting with the one on social and psychological drivers of development, is that how you present, how you frame something which you're offering to people makes a difference. Human psychology is such that it makes a difference. So this report was on the social and psychological dimensions of how to deliver something better. The next report is on internet for development. And it is the use of internet technology, digital technology, more correctly, more than internet, digital technology for that last mile. And India is a prominent player in this with Aadhaar and other things trying to get into that. So that's the second. And we are thinking right now, we haven't yet decided, that we are going to do a third world development report on something which will broadly be a sort of trilogy of three different ways, maybe something to do with organization, management of these systems. So it'll be a sort of three world development reports, all focusing on that last mile delivery. How do you get the benefits into people's hands with as little leakage as possible on the route?
A big part of the rights-based kind of movement is also, in some sense, the interventions of the courts, right? And the courts in India in the past decade have been particularly activist in terms of stepping into what would otherwise be policy space, and often very well-intentioned, but in many, many cases, with kind of recommendations or blanket bans or blanket stuff that to most economists, would be completely suboptimal, right? And so it just seems to me that there is a genuine need for a tradition, kind of legal tradition of economic analysis of the law of the sort that, Posner and others have done in the US. But do you see any such movement here in India? And that seems to be like a massive lacuna, that you've got this unbelievably powerful, unelected entity with no self-corrective mechanisms, because it's not facing legislative feedback or electoral feedback, but that can go down well-intentioned but empirically misguided trajectory.
Actually, right now, for me personally, law and economics is the big research agenda. It's very rudimentary in economics, in India, law and economics. And from a range of fields, including antitrust legislation, you have to have a deep understanding of what the law does. Because even the people who are going and enforcing these interventions, they have to have a bit of an understanding what the law does to the economy. And in India, that's really very rudimentary. This is one area where we are trailing behind the industrialized countries.
Thank you, Kaushik. That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.